Tennessee Summer by Sam Johnson, illustrated by Marnie Backer. Page 3. The plane ride from Omaha to Memphis wasn't long, but it wasn't comfortable either. The disturbances in the air made the flight so bumpy I felt like I was in an old pickup truck instead of an airplane. I glanced at my watch. I was only 15 minutes from spending 3 weeks with Grandpa. My stomach jumped with uncertainty. I couldn't predict how the visit would go. Page 4. Mom and Dad had told me at the airport that they thought Grandpa and I needed to get to know each other. When I visited Grandma and Grandpa before this summer, it was always Grandma I spent my time with. We would go for walks in the woods, and sometimes I'd help her weed her garden. But she had died just over a year ago. Now it would just be Grandpa and me. For such a bumpy flight, the plane landed smoothly. A friendly airline worker met me as I stepped off the plane. Together, we followed the line of passengers down a long hallway into the airport. Right away, I saw Grandpa sitting in the waiting area by the gate. The old overalls I remembered so well were worn but clean. He rose slowly as the airline worker led me to him. Then he and I were alone. "Hi, Jeremy. Glad you made it safe and sound." Grandpa stuck his hand out, and I shook it. "Hi, Grandpa, Cutting me off," he said. "Figured you'd be hungry, so let's eat first." Then he led the way to the baggage claim area. We stood in silence as we waited for my bags. Then Grandpa led the way to his truck. I tossed my bags in the back and hopped in. Page 6. At Kate's Diner, the padded booth was the most comfortable thing I had sat in all day. I looked out the window at the landscape, cars passing in the street, and the green Tennessee mountains rolling high beyond. We were an hour away from Memphis now, in the small town where Grandpa had lived all his life. "Evening, Loralee," Grandpa greeted the waitress gruffly. "I was hoping you'd round up something for me and my daydreaming grandson here." "I'll have a cheeseburger, please," I said stiffly. I never liked being called a daydreamer. I thought of myself as practical and well-grounded. Loralee nodded, smiled, and turned to my grandfather. "I'm guessing you want pork chops." Page 7. Glancing at me, Grandpa said, "Not today. I'll have a cheeseburger too." Grandpa and I waited in another awkward silence. When the waitress brought our food, we ate slowly and quietly. Beside the noises coming from the diner's kitchen and the passing traffic outside, all I could hear was my own chewing. Loralee was at the cash register when we went to pay. Handing Grandpa his change, she winked at him and said, "Don't forget my chair now." "You can't rush art, Loralee," he replied, and she laughed. Back in the truck, we drove over the dark, winding roads to Grandpa's cabin. Page 8. I woke up late the next morning. Breakfast was a cold plate of scrambled eggs and a glass of orange juice waiting for me on the kitchen table. Grandpa was gone. I called out, but my voice came back to me in an echo. The house had never been so quiet when Grandma was in it. Then I heard the scrape of a saw from behind the house. I went outside to investigate. Grandpa was sawing through a stick out on the shed. He gave one last tug on the saw, and one end of the stick toppled to the ground. I couldn't tell what he was working on. Page 9. "Morning," Grandpa said when he saw me. "Hi," I answered. "What are you doing?" He looked at me. "Just cutting wood." "Can I watch?" I asked him. Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "Can you keep quiet?" I shrugged. "Sure." "Then you can watch." Grandpa wasn't smiling. I couldn't tell if he was playing with me or not. Page 10. I sat while Grandpa cut through 3 more branches. He added them to a pile of twigs on the floor. When Grandpa stooped and began fitting twigs together, I realized he was putting together a piece of furniture. I could see a seat, 4 legs, and the beginning of a chair back. "Is this Laurelie's chair?" I asked. Grandpa looked at me, then down at the wood. He held a branch up to where the chair's back would be. Then he reached for a tool and began scraping one end of the branch. I was beginning to understand that Grandpa intended to work and not to do a lot of explaining. Page 11. But how could I spend 3 weeks watching Grandpa work without asking questions? If he didn't want to explain his work, I would be confused a lot and bored. Maybe, I thought, I should spend my time in other ways. I wandered out the shed and around to the far side of the house, where Grandma had kept her garden. My heart sank at the pitiful sight. What had once been a lush garden looked now like an immense tangle of weeds. Grandma would be so disappointed, I thought. This garden was her pride and joy. Page 12. I opened the garden gate, bent down, and looked closer. Under the weeds I found a group of plants producing small tomatoes and peppers, many of them ripe. The plants must have sprung up from the seeds of vegetables that had fallen last year. Almost without thinking, I started gathering the tomatoes and peppers and pulling weeds. The smell of the earth brought back a sudden memory of working in the garden with Grandma. This time, though, the memory wasn't painful. It was pleasant, and I felt almost as though she were with me now. The morning passed, and my 2 piles grew, the weed pile taller than the vegetable pile. "Lunchtime," Grandpa called from the back door. Startled, I looked at my watch. It was lunchtime. Where had the morning gone? Page 13. Grandpa had fixed peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and lemonade. As we ate together, I decided to ask again about the chair he was making. Grandpa sighed as though giving in to the idea that he might have to talk to me more than he'd like to. "Well," he started, "there's a craft fair and contest in town in a couple of weeks. I started on that chair as my entry. Then I made the mistake of mentioning it to Laurelie. She said she'd been wanting a homemade chair herself. Do you think it'll be ready in time for the fair?" I asked. Grandpa acted like he hadn't heard my question and went on chewing his sandwich. I guessed I was going to have to get used to this method of silent communication. Page 15. By the end of the afternoon, I had finished weeding the garden and picked all the ripe vegetables. A few vegetables had rotted. These and the weeds I took to Grandma's compost pile and stirred it with the pitchfork she had used. Then I stopped to admire my work. Only a few scattered plants remained in the patch, but they could breathe better now than that the soil around them was cleared and loosened. I felt very satisfied. Finally, I took the ripe veggies into the kitchen and washed them at the sink. When Grandpa came in, he was holding some of the weeds. "You've pulled up your grandma's mother's dill," he said, giving me a handful of delicate green strands. I didn't reply. "What do you plan to do with these?" He gestured toward the vegetables. I shrugged my shoulders. "Eat them?" I said. "Well, that's fine," he said, "but we can't eat them all at once. Better stick them in the fridge so they don't go bad." Page 16. The next day, I woke up with an ambitious plan. If I could watch Grandpa work, I could keep caring for Grandma's garden. I would weed it, water it if too little rain fell, and cook whatever grew, starting with what Grandpa had in the refrigerator. I boiled water for spaghetti in one pot and cooked tomatoes and peppers in another. For extra flavor, I chopped up all the dill and added it to the tomato sauce. 17. When Grandpa tasted the sauce at dinner time, he winced. "If you want to cook," he said, Follow a master. Try some of your grandmother's recipes. They're in that cupboard. He pointed across the room. Later, I leafed through Grandma's familiar green box. The recipes weren't in any special order, so I read one after another, remembering the flavors of her food. On one scrap of strained paper, I found a jam recipe. It looked like the easiest thing, just fruit, sugar, and lemon juice. I remembered where Grandma had stored her giant kettle and jam jars. That's it, I thought. I'll make jam. I might even try to sell some at the craft fair. Page 18. I mentioned my idea to Grandpa. He suggested hunting for blackberries in the morning. I remembered that some wild blackberry bushes grew in a nearby wooded area. I'd like to come along, Grandpa said. I've got a feeling there's some good timber out there too. The next morning, we headed into the woods. I had Grandma's berry baskets and Grandpa had his saw. Page 19. Every 50 feet, Grandpa would bend down to take a look at a sapling. Looking for a part of Laurelie's chair? I asked. He shook his head. Nope, just thinking ahead. Anything I pick up today needs to dry for a few months first, so it won't shrink after I use it. Grandpa examined a low branch on a hickory tree as he spoke. I like something solid, with no bugs and good bark. He raised his saw, cut the branch through, then held it toward me. See how it branches into 3 smaller limbs? That'll make a fine chair back. In another 5 minutes, we reached the blackberry bushes. I picked ripe fruit up until my baskets were full, and Grandpa helped. Finally, he peered into the baskets. Not a bad day for either of us. Ready to head back? He asked. I nodded and handed him a berry. Page 20. For the next few days, I cooked jam in the kitchen while Grandpa worked in the shed with his wood. I started with small branches of jam to make sure I got the right amount of ingredients. My first batch was scorched and bitter with too much lemon juice. Burnt and sour was Grandpa's verdict. The second batch was heavy and too sweet, but edible. You're getting there, Grandpa encouraged. The third batch was sweet and tart, like fresh berries. I used the rest of the berries and spent one morning picking another bucket full. I filled 10 jars with sweet, dark jam. Page 21. On the morning of the craft fair, I loaded my jam jars into a box and onto Grandpa's truck. Grandpa came from the shed, carrying his handiwork. I hadn't seen the chair since the first day. It didn't look like a pile of twigs anymore. It was a beautifully finished chair. Grandpa had sanded smooth the seat, back, and arms, but he had left the rough texture of the wood on all the other parts. Grandpa, I said, it almost looks like it grew its shape right in the forest. Grandpa said nothing in response, but he gave me a little smile. He tied the chair down in the back of the truck. Then we started into town. Page 22. The day at the fair was a long one. Grandpa didn't win a prize, and I sold only 1 jar of jam. But as we were leaving, we ran into Laurelie. That chair wins first prize in my book, she said to Grandpa. I'd be happy to buy it, and I'll take 3 jars of berry jam too. I helped her put the jam in her basket. She counted out several bills and closed them into my fist. We'll deliver the chair tonight, Grandpa promised, and we did. Laurelie said she was sure that all her neighbors would be placing orders for chairs with Grandpa before long. Page 23. The day I left, I visited the garden one last time. I gathered a paper bag full of vegetables for Grandpa. When he put my things in the truck for the ride back to Memphis and the airport, he gave the vegetables back to me. Cook them for your folks, he said. Somebody's got to make sure they eat right. He winked. I grinned back. What about you? He chuckled. It was the first time I'd made him laugh. I'll eat your jam. Safe trip, Jeremy." Then he reached over and gave me a hug. Page 24. After saying goodbye to Grandpa at the airport and boarding the plane, I pushed the vegetable bag under the seat in front of me and buckled my seatbelt. The scent of fresh earth drifted up from the vegetable bag. I glanced at my watch. If the flight was on schedule, I just might be home in time to fix dinner. The end.